cannot express the love and tenderness. Welcome to episode 1 of the Boyband Chronicles with Tali. I thought about doing this, what was it, like 2 weeks ago? I was like, I'm in my boy band era, so why don't we talk about it? And I wanted to do video style because it's a lot of information. We're going to be talking about in this little series, we're just going to do boy bands from back in the 60s to now. So the top 3 boy bands from each decade. It was really hard trying not to put too much information, so I had to cut it down a lot to only like key parts. So there might be gaps. If I would have put all the information about each one, it would have been a long ass video. For example, the Beatles, oh my god, there was so much information that took up 3 pages of my notes, and I was like, yeah, we need to consolidate. So before we do talk about each boy band, it is really important to talk about what a boy band is, just to get an understanding. So boy bands go all the way back from the 19th century with a cappella barbershop quartets. They were men who sang in 4-part harmonies. They grew more popular in the 1940s with doo-wop groups, and they sang about topics such as love, relationships, stuff we hear in pop music today. Boy bands are a group of men that not only create pop music, but they usually sing or dance. It usually consists of like 5, maybe like the most common ones are like 5, maybe 4, 3. They can usually consist of attractive men that have their own kind of like title. So titles that some like the boys can have in like the group is like the heartthrob, the boy next door, the bad boy, the shy one, things like that. Finding bands for the 60s and 70s were kind of hard because they usually were rock bands or like pop rock, and they really didn't fit the stereotypical boy band mold that we see today. But I tried really hard just to find, the most iconic ones and the ones that kind of revolutionized what a boy band is today. I thought it would be interesting as well if I were to choose my favorite from each band I cover. Say I was a girl in the 60s and I was a Beatles fan, like who would be my favorite, like something like that. So the first band that I immediately thought of for the 60s were the Beatles. For the Beatles, if I was a girl in the 60s, my favorite member would be George. So the Beatles were basically just probably one of, or the most iconic band that has ever lived. They revolutionized how we hear pop music today. The Beatles were an English rock band back in the 60s. They went from like the 60s to like late 70s, early 80s, like very early 80s. For a little beginning, like a little backstory, John Lennon started a band called the Quarrymen in 1956. They included John Lennon, Stu Sutcliffe, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Pete Best. The Quarrymen was their first name until July of 1960, where they changed their name to the Silver Beatles. In August of 1960, they did another name change, and that's where they just stuck with the Beatles. When they did shows in Hamburg, Germany, that is when they really found their sound and their identity and how they wanted to be. In 1961, Stu left to focus on his art career. In 1961, they meet their manager, Brian Epstein. In 1962, they then signed to EMI's Parlophone record, and George Martin was the record producer for that. In August of 1962, Pete left, and then Ringo came in the same month and year. So now it's Paul, George, Ringo, and John. And that's the Beatles. In October of 1962, they released their first single, Love Me Do, and it reached number 17 on the British single charts. In January of 1963, they released their second single, Please Please Me, and that went number 1 on the British single charts. Please Please Me stayed number 1 on the British single charts for 2 weeks. Period. Then in March of 1963, they released their album, Please Please Me, and that went number 1 in the UK. Their first album, Please Please Me, stayed number 1 on the British charts for 29 weeks. Then Please Please Me was released here in the United States, July of 1963, but it didn't do that great here. In 1963, the term Beatlemania comes alive due to the reactions of all their fans when they did tour in England. And let me tell you, Beatlemania was insane. I was watching videos about it, and Lord, like, I don't think we ever saw another Beatlemania. Like, then in 1963, I Wanna Hold Your Hand was released in the UK and immediately went number 1. And in December of 1963, I Wanna Hold Your Hand released here in the United States. It goes number 1 and stays there for 7 weeks. Also in 1963, they then signed with Capitol Records. In January of 1964, Capitol Records releases Meet the Beatles, which 2 weeks after its release goes number 1 here in the US. That album also stayed on the charts at number 1 for 11 weeks. They were killing it. They were killing the game. Then in February of 1964, they performed on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that's what kind of made them even boom bigger here in the US. In March of 1964, the Beatles had songs in the top 5 positions on the Billboard charts, a first for Billboard. The songs were Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. The Beatles also did quite a few films like Help, A Hard Day's Night, and like The Yellow Submarine. The soundtracks for Help and A Hard Day's Night did reach #1 both in the UK and in the US. Worldwide album sales for the Beatles topped 600 million. So the number of singles that reached #1 was 21, and that is the most that has been done by any band. They released 12 studio albums, 5 live albums, 51 compilation albums, and 36 extended plays, which are just EPs. They released 63 singles, 17 box sets, 22 video albums, and they also released 53 music videos. The end of the Beatles was a lot of contributing factors. Like their manager died in 1967, John Lennon's drug use, and just so many other reasons. So in September of 1969, John Lennon couldn't announce publicly because of contract that he left, but he did leave the Beatles in 1969. Time jump, in 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside of his apartment in New York. Another time jump to 2001 where George Harrison died of cancer. That means there's 2 Beatles left, Paul and Ringo. The impact of the Beatles was very big. Like it was a time, and like everyone knows who the Beatles are. They're influenced. So the Beatles definitely influenced, in my opinion, like the way albums are produced, the sound, how we hear pop music today. The Beatles are also the #1 best-selling artists of all time. They're #1. #2 is Elvis, and #3 is Michael. As for like their style, they usually stuck to the suits and started venturing out into color, but you would always see them in some sort of suit. The Beatles in 1988 were also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Overall, they are regarded as the most influential band of all time. They were a big part of the development of the 1960s culture and basically just how we hear pop music today. Not to mention that they did just release their last song and their last music video, I think it was last year, and with the power of technology, they were able to get John's vocals and George playing the guitar. So another band that I wanted to cover was the Beach Boys. Cowabunga, dude. So the Beach Boys were a band back in the 60s, and they came out during like that surf era, like in California. If I was a girl in the 60s, my favorite Beach Boy would be Dennis Wilson. So the Beach Boys were one of America's most adored and most popular boy bands. Their style of music was like surf rock. Like if you would go in like a surf shop, that's how I imagined it. But it's like surf rock, pop, kinda. But I grew up in Hawthorne, California, and this was a time when that new surf wave was coming, and they grew up during that. So the Beach Boys were originally composed of the 3 Wilson brothers, Dennis, Carl, and Brian, and then it was Al and then Mike. Al was a school friend, and then Mike was their cousin. The Beach Boys, it gets really confusing as the years go on because there's so many changes of like in and out, in and out, in and out. So I'm only going to include a couple of changes in here, but not like I'm not including all the changes that were made. So before they were the Beach Boys, they were named the Pendletones, and they got the Pendletones from a brand they used to wear. It was the Pendletons, like Pendleton shirts. It was wool and like kind of like flannel, you know, and like all like the surfers were wearing them. So when they saw that those were on the rise, they started to use that as kind of like their brand. So their manager was actually the Wilsons brothers' dad, Murray Wilson. When they bought their music to Candix Records, the label wanted to change their name to the Surfers, but then a music executive was like, wait, that's taken, can't do that. So that's where they got the Beach Boys from. That name ultimately commercialized them for decades. In 1961, they released their first single, Surfin', which did pretty well. It reached #3 in Southern California and #75 on the Billboard charts. This is where the first change comes in. Early 1962, Al left the band. I think it was to focus on schooling, and then that's when David Marks comes in. Then they released their other singles, Surfin' Safari and 409. Surfin' Safari peaked 14 on the Billboard charts, and 409 stayed on the Billboard charts at 76 for a week. The boys then signed to Capitol Records in 1962. In October, they released their first album, Surfin' Safari. Their debut album, Surfin' Safari, reached #32 on the charts. In 1963, they started recording their second album, which then Brian Wilson started getting more into like the production of it, songwriting, you know, the behind the scenes. Their second album, Surfin' USA, released in March of 1963, reached #2 on the Billboard chart. Their second album, Surfing USA, also made surf music go bigger. Surfing USA is the album that like put them on the map. Like, okay, watch out for these guys. At the beginning of the tour in the Midwest in April of 1963, Al came back to the band. After Al came back, Brian left to focus more on like the production of the albums and making the albums and songwriting and stuff like that. After Brian left, he produced their album Surfer Girl, which then released in September of 1963. So during this time, it was the British invasion. So when the Beatles were starting to get big here in the United States, and the Beatles were also signed to Capitol Records. So when the Beatles started getting bigger, the attention or like the support that Capitol Records gave the Beach Boys was starting to slim down, which forced their manager to start fighting for them even more. Next, the single Fun 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 was released, and it was a major hit. In 1964, Murray Wilson was fired. Their first number one single was I Get Around, and that was released in May of 1994. Their Christmas album is known as the finest holiday album in the rock era during that time. So there was a bit of legal trouble with them. In result of the legal troubles, their label contract expired June 30th of 1969. Capitol Records deleted the Beach Boys catalog from print, which cut off their royalty flow. The 1980s were a whirlwind for them. A lot happened. In the 1980s, Carl quit the group to focus on a solo career. Brian then rejoined the group to tour in 1983, and in 1983, December 28th, Dennis died by drowning. So the Beach Boys actually did do a few stuff recently over the past few years. Beach Boy style is very recognizable. They always used to wear the Pendletons with the khaki shorts and khaki pants. They are still known as one of the most critically acclaimed and successful bands. They sold over 100 million records worldwide. The group has over 80 songs. 36 of their songs were in the top 40, and they had 4 songs topping the Billboard chart. Many artists use the Beach Boys as their inspiration. A lot of them say that Pet Sounds, an album from the Beach Boys, is an inspiration when creating their albums. The Rolling Stones ranked the Beach Boys at number 12 for the greatest artist of all time. They were also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Throughout my research, I just saw a lot of like that Pet Sounds was definitely their most influential, just because how different it sounded from their other albums, and the songwriting, the production, like everything was so different. And the last band for this episode is the Monkees. When I was researching the Monkees, I was very surprised because this band, how they came along, reminded me how another one of our bands came along, who we'll cover in the 2010s. This is interesting because this is definitely different than they have a different background than what everyone else had, and their career was a bit more short-lived, but they did still make a huge impact and they still were very successful. The Monkees was a fictional sitcom show that was made to take advantage of Beatlemania. It aired from 1966 to 1968. The show was made by TV producer Rob Rafelson. He wanted to create something centered around his experiences as a music artist himself. So on September 8th of 1965, the audition announcement was put in publications, and basically it just said they were looking for boys 17 to 21. They were looking for folk and rock singers. Ultimately, the 4 boys that were chosen were Bobby, Michael, Mickey, and Peter. If I was a girl in the 1960s and I was like, oh my god, the Monkees, love them, who would I pick? Peter Tork is my favorite from the Monkees. Filmed the plot in late 1965, and ultimately NBC picked up the show. So, production started happening, and they were getting together as a band. They had to learn how to play together as a group, which was really hard for them, especially because Mickey was learning the drums from scratch. So they all had challenges they had to overcome, and they had to try to sound as cohesive as possible. So in August of 1966, their debut single Last Train to Clarksville was released. In September of 1966, the show aired. Then their self-titled album was released on October 10th in 1966. And it spent 8 weeks at number 1. Their second album, More of the Monkees, was released on January 9th of 1967. And it spent 18 weeks at number 1. So during the recording of the first 2 albums, they really didn't have any time to have some input in the album. So the instruments that you heard, it was just session instruments and bands that they had. For their third album, called Headquarters, they actually played most of their instruments. That album was released on May 22nd of 1967. Their fourth album, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones, was released on November 6th of 1967 and stayed at number 1 for 5 weeks. In 1968, the show was canceled. That same year, Peter left the band due to being just exhausted with it. So after Peter left, Mickey, Dobby, and Michael, the three remaining, then went on to record some more albums until Michael left in 1971 to focus on his solo career. And then Mickey and Dobby recorded one last album before calling it quits. Over the years, the group has reunited. Dobby died February of 2012 and Pete died February of 2019. Overall, they have sold 75 million records, and that makes them one of the best-selling groups of all time. They are the first and only act to have 4 number ones on the Billboard 200 in a calendar year. You know, their career was really short, meaning like they weren't around as long as the Beatles or the Beach Boys was. They still made a cultural impact on music. So that was episode 1. That was the 60s. I'm so excited to get into the 70s. The 70s should be posted next Monday. So